The greatest amphibious gamble of the 20th century began because a storm blinked. If the clouds had held for another day, the Armada would have turned back, nerves shredded and secrecy frayed. If the wind had risen again at dawn, landing craft would have ridden broken water into machine gun sights. What tipped history toward the beaches of Normandy on the 6th June 1944 was not certainty, but a slender window of weather and will. So what made leaders risk everything on a margin that thin? This story matters because it joins courage to coordination and proves that freedom, however cherished, must be organized. It shows how planning, deception, engineering, and moral restraint can compress chaos into a path forward, even when the enemy shoots back and the sea itself argues against you. In a century that learned to mass-produce both hope and tragedy, D-Day is where democracies learned to mass-produce discipline. If you value thoughtful, rigorously told history that asks the right questions, subscribe to What If History. So, episodes like this become your weekly time machine. Europe in 1944 was a chessboard scorched by years of total war. In the east, the Red Army was hammering the Wehrmacht back across Ukraine and Poland, draining Germany of men, fuel, and time. In the west, Hitler's engineers had studded the coast with the Atlantic Wall, a belt of bunkers, mines, and artillery from Denmark to the Spanish border. The Western Allies, Britain, the United States, Canada, and a growing coalition, decided they would not win by bombing alone. They would open a Western front, cross the English Channel, and make France a bridge to Germany. Inside the German High Command, an argument sharpened to a point. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel urged a forward defense, tanks near the waterline to crush the invasion on the sand. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt wanted armored reserves held inland to counterattack once the true landing sites were known. Hitler split the difference and weakened both, scattering authority and keeping key reserves under his personal hand. By spring 1944, Allied leaders had chosen Normandy over the narrower Pas de Calais. Calais tempted with shorter crossings and obvious logic, which was precisely why it was dangerous. Normandy offered room for surprise. The plan's success would rest on learning from pain, and the first lesson arrived 2 years earlier across the Channel at Dieppe. In August 1942, a largely Canadian raid hit a fortified port head-on and was scythed down by interlocking guns and tide-pinned armor. The disaster wrote 3 sentences on the blackboard. Do not storm a major port. Create specialized tools for obstacles. And deceive the enemy so thoroughly that when you come, he waits somewhere else. The deception became an opera. Under the umbrella name Bodyguard, a specific chapter called Fortitude built a phantom First United States Army group led on paper by George Patton, the most plausible spearhead the Allies could invent. Inflatable tanks crouched in English fields. Wooden aircraft lined fake airstrips. Radio operators fed a diet of chatter to German ears. Across the Channel, German analysts traced phantom divisions that would never sail. While the stage dressing fooled the eye, aerial reconnaissance mapped every gun, casemate, and culvert. And small teams slipped into the surf by night to scoop sand into sample bags, testing whether tracked vehicles could grip or would sink. Engineering made imagination heavy enough to carry. Major General Percy Hobart shepherded a menagerie of funnies, specialized armored vehicles to clear mines, fling fascines into ditches, swim ashore, and bridge seawalls. 2 artificial harbors called Mulberries were designed to be towed across the Channel, in pieces and assembled on open beaches into working ports. A steel artery named PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean, would later pump fuel from Britain to France, so armor could run on a schedule rather than on prayers. The sea would resist, so the plan built a second sea. The last gatekeeper was the sky. Meteorologists tracked the tantrum of a North Atlantic storm and argued over its eyelash shifts. They predicted a brief calm on 6th June. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, listened to data and doubt, then chose. He knew delay magnified risk, secrecy eroded, troops chilled, the moon and tide fell out of phase. He also drafted a note accepting blame if the landings failed. Leadership in uncertainty is not proving you are right. It is choosing whom you will answer to if you are wrong. The night before the beaches, gliders whispered toward the dark lines of hedgerows and roads. In the east, British airborne troops seized the crossings at Bénouville and Ranville, the bridges that would be renamed Pegasus and Horsa after the aircraft that brought them. Holding them meant the left flank could breathe. To the west, American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Divisions scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula around Sainte-Mère-Église, a town that woke to parachutes hanging from trees and the sudden fact of geography reclaimed. Their mission was to confuse, seize causeways, and block counterattacks rushing toward the beaches. Dawn found the channel crowded with craft of every shape and appetite: destroyers, battleships, transport ships, and above all the blunt-nosed workhorses called LSTs, landing ship, tank, designed to beach themselves and disgorge steel. The armada pointed toward 5 beaches, a left-to-right line that the ear can memorize: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Juno for the British and Canadians. Sword anchoring the far left near the mouth of the Orne, Utah went wrong first and therefore right. Strong currents nudged the landing waves south of the plan zone. Instead of turning back into prepared fire, commanders pushed inland from where they stood. They connected with airborne units and rolled the beachhead open like a hinge. Omaha went wrong and had to be rescued by grit. Steep bluffs funneled infantry into sand and shingle under machine guns that did what they were built for. Some duplex-drive swimming tanks swamped and sank. Leaders died trying to lead. Radios choked on water and smoke. Yet small groups crawled, cut, and climbed. They found draws, used shell holes as steps, and traded minutes for footholds. German headquarters lost time because the weather had made their assumptions feel safe. The deception pointing to Pas de Calais still gripped their map pins. Hitler slept, and the release of armored reserves, held on a tight leash, stalled in bureaucracy and distance. By the time the Panzer divisions moved, the day's balance had shifted. The Atlantic Wall had not been designed to reload quickly. It had been built to be enough once. An American infantryman at Omaha would later describe the sand as a place where distances lied. The first few yards felt like a mile because each step argued with the weight of waterlogged gear. He remembered the sound of bullets clipping the air in flat, angry lines, and the way his world shrank to the lip of a low ridge. He did not imagine flags or maps. He thought of the hand that shoved him forward when he wanted to lie down. He thought of someone he had promised to write, and he promised in return to make it to a place where writing would be possible. When he reached the base of the bluff, he found a rung of roots and pulled, and a stranger's hand pushed from behind. And for a second, the war was a 3-person machine built to manufacture another 3 feet of ground. He did not know the stranger's name. He still climbed. Farther east, a Canadian sapper on Juno Beach lay prone behind an iron obstacle crusted with explosives. His job was to clear a lane through a mine-laced gate while the tide ticked toward the level that would render the obstacle invisible and lethal. He reached for a cutter, listened for the pause between incoming shells, and counted under his breath, because the body believes numbers when nothing else makes sense. When the charge blew, the shock thumped his chest like a door slammed by a giant, but the gate tore open. He waved a team forward, then crawled again, laying Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosive, into coils of wire. He was not fearless. He was professional, which is courage measured in tasks. By evening, tenuous lines on all 5 beaches had thickened into a continuous front. The Allied foothold had cost dearly, but it existed. And existing changed everything. The shore was only the beginning. Normandy's interior was a green maze called bocage, ancient hedgerows grown atop earthen banks, narrow lanes sunken between living walls, fields cut small and edged with ambush points. Tanks could not see before they were seen. Infantry felt watched even when no one fired. The battle for Seine on the eastern side became a grind of attack, counterattack, and rubble that resisted movement as stubbornly as any foe. To the west, the Americans turned north toward Cherbourg, a deep water port on the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, because an army that takes ground must also take hunger seriously. The Germans fought house to house. When Cherbourg fell in late June, its port lay wrecked and would need weeks of repair. As if to remind planners that nature votes, a violent Channel storm blew up in mid-June. One Mulberry harbor off Omaha was destroyed. The other, off Arromanches, limped but lived, a makeshift withstood by sheer stubbornness of steel and seamanship. Supplies still came ashore, on open beaches, by rhino ferries and truck convoys that turned wet sand into arteries. The French resistance, networks of rail saboteurs, guides, and informants, kept cutting Germany's legs. Bridges fell or became traps. Convoys searched for roads that had been trustworthy yesterday. When German units lashed out in fear and rage, they left wounds that would bleed into memory. In the village of Oradour-sur-Glane on 10 June, an SS unit murdered hundreds of civilians, and the ruins were later left in place as a testimony that accountability can be architectural. Leadership itself was shaken. On 17th of July, Rommel was badly wounded when Allied aircraft strafed his car. 3 days later, Hitler survived a bomb planted by German officers who hoped to end the war before their nation was destroyed. The plot failed. Repression tightened. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was dismissed. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge took over in the West and inherited a problem no reserve could solve: too many threats and not enough speed. The answer to the bocage was patience married to invention. American units welded metal prongs to tank noses to make rhino cutters that punched gaps through hedgerows. Artillery learned to fire short, sudden storms instead of long deluges, so German defenders could not hide between barrages. The bet came in late July. Operation Cobra began on the morning of 25th of July, 1944, with a massive carpet bombing just south of St. Lo. The intention was to vaporize a slice of the German line and pour armor through. Bombs do not always land exactly where maps say they should. Some fell short, killing Americans as well as Germans. Yet, when the dust settled and the tanks shifted into gear, the defense cracked into pieces that movement could skip around. Open country replaced hedgerow choke points. Momentum, once missing, arrived in torrents. Armored columns rolled west to secure Brittany and its ports, while others pivoted east and south to form jaws. From the north, British, Canadian, and Polish forces pressed downward. From the south, Americans under George Patton, now commanding a very real Third Army, swept upward. The pocket closed around Falaise and Train in mid-August. Thousands of German soldiers were captured or killed. Many escaped east through the last narrow corridor, but without the heavy equipment that made them dangerous. The campaign's geometry had finally become Allied. Simultaneously, another set of beaches flickered into view on the southern coast of France. In mid-August, Allied forces landed between Toulon and Caen, then surged up the Rhone Valley, linking with Patton's spearheads near Dijon in early September. Along the way, Paris rose, and Free French forces entered the city on 25 August, to an embrace that mixed wild relief with the ache of what occupation had done. A Norman civilian would later tell his grandchildren that liberation arrived not in a single image, but as a series of noises and silences. In June, it had been the drone of planes, the thud of artillery rolling over fields like a heavy step. Cows scattered through hedges and were found days later by soldiers who needed milk as much as memories. In August, it was boots in the lane, an American asking for water in fractured French, a rumor that bread would return. He remembered hiding a radio, hiding his fear, hiding the family's best knife when soldiers, first German, then Allied, took what armies always take. He remembered that his neighbor cheered and wept in the same breath because her son had been fed by strangers before coming home thin and intact. He remembered a new quiet and how suspicious it felt and how quickly he learned to trust it. By September, the Allies were at the borders of the Low Countries and the approaches to Germany. They captured Antwerp, a prize of a port, on the 4th September. But its usefulness remained trapped behind the Scheldt estuary, where German guns and mines controlled the sea lanes. Clearing the Scheldt would take until late November, a reminder that a map's small blue channel can dictate a continent's pace. The line of dragon's teeth and bunkers, called the Siegfried Line, guarded Germany's west. In the Hürtgen Forest, a wet, tangled terrain east of Aachen, the fight became a test of endurance that consumed men for yards. Farther north, the Allies tried a daring shortcut. In September, Operation Market Garden dropped paratroopers along a chain of Dutch bridges up to Arnhem, while ground forces raced up a single road to join them. Many bridges were taken, but the farthest could not be held. The phrase, A bridge too far entered the language to name ambition that outruns logistics. Winter brought Germany's last major counteroffensive. In December, the Ardennes forest shuddered with the sound of panzers pushing west under cloud cover that grounded most Allied aircraft. The attack bulged the Allied line, split units, and surrounded the town of Bastogne, where American paratroopers held a cold, starving line, while generals argued with fuel gauges. When the weather cleared, Allied planes returned to the sky, and Patton wheeled his army north to break the siege. The German advance spent itself not only against resistance, but against arithmetic. There was not enough fuel to feed the promise on their maps. The Rhine River had always been a symbol, as well as a barrier. On 7th of March 1945, American troops reached Remagen and found the Ludendorff Bridge standing. They crossed before it collapsed days later. Elsewhere, orchestrated crossings followed, including a massive assault under Field Marshal Montgomery farther north. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, was encircled in April, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners surrendered. As Allied units drove east, they opened concentration camps, Buchenwald near Weimar, Dachau near Munich, and faced a catastrophe that numbers could not explain. Soldiers looked at bodies and wire and tried to reconcile liberation with what had been allowed to exist. On 25th of April, near the town of Torgau on the Elbe River, American and Soviet soldiers met and shook hands atop a damaged bridge. That handshake did not end the war, but it fixed the lines that diplomacy had drawn. The Western Allies halted short of Berlin, which the Red Army assaulted from the east. In early May, Germany surrendered. 2 dates mark the moment: 7 May in Reims, 8 May in Berlin, and Europe breathed. The guns fell silent, but the work of building a peace that could last had only begun. In Nuremberg, starting in November 1945, surviving Nazi leaders were tried before an international tribunal, and the law reached for a vocabulary that could name crimes against humanity without replacing compassion with vengeance. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 codified protections for prisoners and civilians, an attempt to bind future hands before future storms. The Marshall Plan pumped capital into the wrecked economies of Western Europe, not as charity alone, but as strategy. Stability is cheaper than collapse. In 1951, the European coal and steel community pulled key industries among historic rivals, making the raw materials of war shared and supervised, planting an institutional seed that would grow into the European Union. Look again at Overlord through this lens. Planning did not end on 6th of June. It matured into procedures, alliances, and norms that outlived the uniforms. Logistics, once used to land tanks, were used to rebuild bridges and schools. Coalition management, once used to align armies, was used to align ministries and currencies. Responsibility to civilians, once briefed as a legal constraint, became a principle for recovery. The memory of the war was curated deliberately. Museums and cemeteries on the Normandy coast preserved ruins at Oradour-sur-Glane, school lessons that tried to balance heroism with humility. Living memory means we choose to remember with evidence rather than with slogans. It means letters, after-action reports, and eyewitness accounts are kept in conversation with each other, not placed on a pedestal where they harden into comforting myths. What did D-Day teach beyond how to cross a hostile beach? It taught that preparation is a form of respect for the men who would risk their lives, for the civilians who would live with the consequences, and for the idea that democracies can act decisively without abandoning restraint. It taught that coalitions do not merely add flags, they add competence when they coordinate honestly. It taught that the law can be an instrument of mercy when it limits excess, and an instrument of strength when it upholds accountability. And it taught that humility is not weakness but calibration, the ability to admit friction and adapt. Germany's surrender on 7 to 8 May 1945 ended the fighting in Europe, but it began an argument with memory that continues. The Nuremberg trials offered one answer. Individuals at the helm of a state can be held to account by a court. The 1949 Geneva Conventions offered another. Bind future combatants to humane limits before tempers flare. The Marshall Plan and the European coal and steel community offered a third. Integrate economies so tightly that war's incentives lose their grip. These institutions grew from the same soil that sustained the invasion. Make a plan, test it against reality, and share the burden. Before the ending, step for a moment into the narrow corridor where one hinge slips and the corridor grows dark. If the weather window had closed on 6th of June, the invasion fleet would have dispersed, men sick and shaken, secrecy leaking hour by hour. Another attempt 2 weeks later would have sailed under a heavier sky of German suspicion. Reconnaissance would have noticed the rehearsal patterns. U-boats, warned by a near strike, would have seeded the approaches with more torpedoes. V-1 flying bombs, already beginning to arc toward London in mid-June, would have multiplied their toll on civilians while politicians counted votes and nerves. In that delayed summer, the Red Army would have continued west through Poland and the Baltic states without the diversion of a Western Front pinning divisions in France. Warsaw's doomed uprising in August 1944 would still meet silence, but the strategic map would tilt further. Soviet forces would stand deeper in Central Europe by the time the Channel crossing finally succeeded. The liberation of Western Europe would still come, but the line of post-war occupation would be drawn farther west, because lines that armies hold on the day a government collapses often harden into borders the next year. It is not hard to imagine a colder Cold War, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, perhaps even parts of Austria pulled under an earlier, heavier curtain, their post-war elections no more than dress rehearsals for a script already written. If the deception called Fortitude had failed, and German analysts had seen through the Phantom Army in Kent, panzer divisions could have been positioned close to the real beaches. Imagine Omaha with assault waves met not only by fixed guns, but by armored counterattacks rolling onto the sand before the first foothold was cut in the bluffs. In that picture, the shingle becomes a trap without exit. Commanders call withdrawals under fire. Beachmasters signal chaos, and destroyers run themselves nearly aground to throw shells point-blank at tanks. A repulse at one or two beaches would not end the war, but it would carve a scar across Allied politics. Churchill would face a crisis of confidence in London. Franklin Roosevelt, running for a fourth term in November 1944, would weather a tighter election, with families asking why sons were sent into a wall. The timetable would stretch. Resources might tilt temporarily toward Italy or southern France while the Channel Plan was rebuilt. Every month lost on the Norman coast would be found by the Red Army on the Vistula and the Oder. The camps would stand longer. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 45, already a calamity, would deepen into something worse if northern Netherlands remained occupied into the spring or summer. Rail lines broken, food embargoes tightened, and bitter cold joined by scarcity the following year. If the Mulberry harbours had both been destroyed in the mid-June storm, the beachhead would have survived, but the breakout would have slowed to the pace of weather and tide. Supplies can be manhandled over open beaches for a while, but an army that expects to move cannot live on improvisation. Trucks would have lined up like penitent pilgrims, waiting for surf to slacken. More cargo would be lost to wind. Commanders would have chosen between speed and blood, attack sooner with thinner stocks and pay in casualties, or wait for ports and pay in time. Waiting would have magnified suffering for French civilians trapped between hungry armies. Pitched battles in the bocage would have grown more reliant on close air support and artillery to compensate for thin armor and fuel, and towns like St. Lo, already pulverized, would have become ash on the map. The lesson is not that engineering solves everything, but that logistics prevents 1,000 small tragedies from aggregating into one large one. If Antwerp had been taken, as it was, but the Scheldt estuary had not been cleared at all before winter, the Allied campaign would have suffered a constriction at the throat. Long supply lines reaching from Normandy across war-ruined roads would have delayed operations on the German frontier. The decision to gamble on Market Garden might have been postponed, or perversely made more tempting, because a leap across the Rhine offered the illusion of bypassing the logistics problem rather than solving it. In the Netherlands, the blockade that produced the hunger winter would have lasted longer, and every week of delay translates into more silent kitchens, more cold hands, more funerals without wood for coffins. When analysts talk about ports and throughput, they are also talking about children in unheated rooms. The Scheldt's mines were not a footnote. They were a sentence passed on civilians until cleared. What if Market Garden had succeeded and a resilient bridgehead had been held at Arnhem in September 1944? The war would not have ended by Christmas, but the winter would have been different. With a firm crossing over the lower Rhine, Allied planners could have staged a two-pronged advance into the North German plain, forcing German high command to split scarce reserves between resisting the Soviets in the east and blocking a deep western thrust in the north. The Ardennes counteroffensive would have been far riskier for Germany to mount, perhaps still attempted, but under a shorter fuel leash and with fewer surprise options. The Netherlands would have been liberated sooner, shortening the hunger winter and saving thousands of civilians. The post-war line might have shifted east by a day's march or two, minor on a globe, major in the lives of towns that would have negotiated with one set of occupiers instead of another. At Yalta, in February 1945, the Western Allies would have spoken with more leverage, not enough to unmake Soviet security demands, but enough to press for earlier, firmer guarantees of pluralism in Central Europe. The Iron Curtain might still have fallen, but farther east and with thinner iron. If, conversely, the German Ardennes offensive had achieved its core aim, seizing Antwerp and splitting the Allied front, the calendar would still have doomed the Reich. But the path would have been jagged and cruel. Logistics would have unraveled for American armies north of the break. British and Canadian forces would have faced the risk of isolation near the Scheldt. Reconnecting the front would have taken months of winter fighting over ground already starved of shelter. Civilian casualties in Belgium and the Netherlands would have climbed as towns passed back and forth. American morale, buoyed since the breakout from Normandy, would have been battered. In Washington, unconditional surrender might still have remained policy. But the pressure to consider intermediate steps, armistices or partitions, would have grown audible, especially if Japan's war still demanded men and ships. The more time Germany bought in the West, the more territory the Soviets would have purchased in the East, and the more negotiations at war's end would have resembled confirmations rather than bargains. The moral aftermath would have been harder to square with the promise that democracies made to themselves about how wars should end, decisively, with crimes named and tried rather than buried in fatigue. If the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had fallen before a crossing, the Rhine would still have been forced, but not as quickly. And speed at that moment was not a flourish. The bridge's sudden availability gave Allied commanders a rare gift. Surprise along a river the enemy believed impregnable. Without it, crossings would have waited for slower, larger operations, inviting German reserves to concentrate more precisely. A delay of weeks does not sound large on a timeline already 4 years long, but those weeks would have moved the calendar of liberation forward into later April or May. More trains would have carried prisoners deeper into Germany ahead of advancing troops. More columns of evacuees would have clogged roads where artillery searched for targets. The camps would not have grown less lethal while they waited. Even a small shift in dates can be measured in names carved or not carved on stone. If the German High Command had listened fully to Rommel and massed armor at the shoreline, D-Day might have turned on a knife that morning. If they had listened fully to Rundstedt and concentrated a mobile reserve farther inland, the beachheads might have met a steel wall on day 2 rather than day 1. Hitler's compromise, disastrous for Germany as a strategy, was merciful for some of the men on both sides. The lesson is not that an enemy's mistake is your plan. The lesson is that the difference between calamity and victory can be a single meeting's outcome, and you must plan not only for what you hope the enemy does, but for what the enemy ought to do. Even the most optimistic counterfactual carries warnings. Suppose everything had gone better for the Western Allies. Market Garden holds, Antwerp opens early, the Rhine is crossed in the autumn, Berlin is taken from both sides, and the war in Europe ends in January 1945. The map of post-war Europe might have shifted, yes, but the war in the Pacific would still have demanded attention. The Holocaust's ledger would remain unpayable, and the task of building institutions out of victory would still have required patient, plural hands. A faster military success does not automatically translate into gentler politics. Occupations still must be administered, refugees housed, famines averted, resentments defused. The miracle of 1945 was not only that the guns quieted, but that in the quiet, victors remembered restraint. Most chilling is the thought of delay compounded. If D-Day had been postponed into late summer, if Fortitude had leaked, if Mulberry's had perished, if Antwerp had stayed choked, and if the Ardennes had bit deeper, the war in Europe might have extended into late 1945 or even 1946. The Red Army might have reached farther into the heart of Germany before pausing. Millions more civilians would have faced another winter of occupation, scarcity, and fear. Cities already damaged would have been hammered by more bombing because when ground forces slow, air forces compensate. The refugees already on the roads would have been joined by countless others, and the post-war resettlement of millions of people, Poles, Germans, Balts, Jews, would have been even more chaotic. The legal reckonings at Nuremberg might have looked more like victor's justice to a tired world, if fatigue rather than clarity had framed the trials. The Geneva Conventions might still have been written, but their authority would have started lower, because authority rests not only on words, but on the condition of the people who hear them. Counterfactuals are not games when they remind us what planning prevented. The art of organization at Normandy was not an exercise in elegance. It was a way to shorten a war, to spare towns from one more bombardment, to lift blockades weeks earlier, to interrupt atrocities anywhere even a day sooner. The storm blinked, deception held, engineering worked often enough, and leaders chose to accept the risk that comes with responsibility. Change any one of those, and the bill grows, not only in statistics, but in birthdays missed, in families that never stood together for a photograph, in villages that would have rebuilt a year later and carried grief a year longer. The stakes of D-Day were never just a stretch of French coast. They were calendars, kitchens, classrooms, and courts for decades to come. 4 lessons remain compact enough to carry. Preparation turns uncertainty into a manageable risk. Coordination turns many good efforts into one great effort. Law keeps victory from corroding into cruelty. Humility keeps success from hardening into complacency. If this way of telling the past speaks to you, if you want history that is rigorous, humane, and alive, subscribe to What If History and join a community that treats memory as a public good rather than a weapon. Picture, finally, the tide at Arromanches at dusk, quiet water curling around the old harbor blocks, a gull lifting into a sky no longer watched for bombers, and names on white stones looking out to sea, steady as a promise kept.